250 BCE, Buddhism is exploding across India. Millions practicing, monasteries rising everywhere. The Dhamma is alive. But there's a problem nobody wants to talk about. Everything the Buddha taught, still living in people's heads. Every word, every teaching, every discourse, memorized by monks and passed down through chanting. Nothing written, nothing permanent. And yeah, Buddhism teaches that nothing is permanent. That's kind of the whole point. Everything changes. But there's a difference between understanding impermanence as a teaching and just forgetting what the Buddha said. One's enlightenment, the other's just losing stuff. One epidemic, one war, one generation that forgets, gone forever. This is the story of how Buddhism's oldest teachings almost disappeared from the world, and how a tiny island nobody paid attention to became the place that kept them alive. The Buddha dies around 480 BCE. We covered his final days in another video, how he knew his time was coming. Those last teachings under the sal trees. Suddenly, the person who could clarify any confusion, answer any question, settle any debate. He's gone. His followers gather. The first Buddhist council happens just months after the Buddha's death. 500 arahants, enlightened monks, people who had achieved what the Buddha achieved. They come together at Rajagaha. Their mission, make absolutely sure they get the teachings right. Ananda, the Buddha's closest attendant, the guy who spent 25 years by his side. He recites everything, every discourse, every conversation, every teaching the Buddha gave. The other monks confirm it. Yes, we heard that too. That's exactly what he said. We remember. They organize everything into 3 collections, 3 baskets. That's what Tipiṭaka means. Piṭaka means basket, like containers for storing grain. The Tipiṭaka, the 3 baskets of the Buddha's complete teachings. The Vinaya Piṭaka, the first basket, the monastic rules. The Sutta Piṭaka, the second basket, the Buddha's discourses. And what would later become the Abhidhamma Piṭaka, the third basket, the systematic philosophy. These 3 collections together, the Tipiṭaka, the complete record of what the Buddha taught. Problem solved, right? Except they don't write any of it down. Sacred teachings? Those lived in the minds of trained memorizers. The oral tradition had preserved the Vedas for over 1,000 years. Why would Buddhism be different? So the teachings spread the same way, monk to monk, teacher to student. Memorization and repetition. Picture 200 monks chanting in unison at a monastery. Every word perfectly synchronized. Every discourse preserved in living memory. It's beautiful. It's impressive. And it works. For a while. Fast forward 200 years. Emperor Aśoka converts to Buddhism around 260 BCE. Buddhism has royal backing, massive resources, official support. The Dhamma spreads to every corner of his empire. Thousands of monks, hundreds of monasteries, millions of followers. Buddhism is thriving, but Aśoka sees what nobody else is seeing. The teachings are fragmenting, different groups remembering things differently. Schools forming, each claiming they have the authentic version. Monks debating, sometimes fighting, over what the Buddha actually said. Because oral tradition works perfectly, until it doesn't. Every time a teaching passes from one person to another, there's a chance for change. Maybe someone misremembers a word. Maybe regional dialects creep in. Maybe emphasis shifts. Multiply that by hundreds of monks across thousands of miles over generations. The risk isn't theoretical anymore. Aśoka realizes if something isn't done, if Buddhism keeps expanding without a fixed reference point, the Buddha's actual words could be lost in a sea of interpretations. He makes a radical decision: send the Dhamma everywhere, to places so remote, so isolated, that even if India falls apart, even if Buddhism collapses at its center, it might survive somewhere else. And then he does something that changes his family forever. He sends his own son away on a mission that might fail completely. According to the Mahavamsa, the ancient Sri Lankan chronicle written centuries after these events, Mahinda was Ashoka's son, born a prince, raised with every privilege imaginable, and he gives it all up to become a Buddhist monk. Whether Mahinda was literally Ashoka's biological son or a close disciple, the chronicle's honored with that title. Historians still debate. The relationship might have been spiritual rather than biological. But the mission he took on, that was real. Ashoka tells him, "I need you to do something dangerous. I'm sending you to Lanka." Lanka, an island south of India that most people in the empire barely knew existed. Reports said there was a king there, Devanampiya Tissa, who might be interested in the Dhamma. Might be. No guarantees, no backup plan. Mahinda would sail across the ocean carrying the entire Buddhist teachings in his memory and try to convert a king he'd never met in a land he'd never seen. If it works, Buddhism takes root in new soil. If it fails, the teachings might not survive what's coming. What does Mahinda say? The Mahavamsa doesn't record his words, just that he accepted the mission. Imagine that conversation. Your father, the most powerful man alive, telling you he needs you to leave everything behind for a teaching, for a possibility, and you say yes. From the outside, it looks insane. From inside the Dhamma, it makes perfect sense. Mahinda gathers a small group of monks. They make the journey. The year is around 250 BCE. They arrive in Lanka during the Vesak full moon. The island is lush, tropical, isolated. King Tissa is out hunting deer in the forests near Mihintale. The Mahavamsa describes this moment. Tissa is tracking a deer, focused, bow drawn. Then someone calls his name. He turns. There's a monk standing there, calm, smiling, completely out of place in the middle of a hunt. "Who are you?" Tissa asks. "We are monks, followers of the Buddha, come from across the sea." Tissa could have been suspicious. Random strangers in royal hunting grounds? That's usually bad news. But something about Mahinda's presence, Tissa listens. Mahinda tests him with a riddle, points to a mango tree. "Great king, what do you call this tree?" "A mango tree." "Are there other mango trees besides this one?" "Many." "And besides this mango tree and the other mango trees, are there any other trees?" Tissa pauses. He's getting it. "Yes, trees that are not mango trees." "And besides those trees and the mango trees, are there any other trees?" "Only this one, venerable sir." Mahinda smiles. The king understands. Particular and universal. Individual and general. The way a good mind sees both the one and the many. The Dhamma can take root here. Within days, Tissa converts. Within weeks, he's building monasteries. Within months, Buddhism has an official home in Lanka. The mission succeeded. But here's what neither Mahinda nor Tissa could have known. This wasn't just spreading Buddhism. This was setting up its survival. Jump forward to the 1st century BCE. Buddhism in Sri Lanka is thriving. Generations of monks have been practicing, teaching, preserving the Dhamma. Then disaster strikes. Famine. The Dipavamsa and Mahavamsa both describe it as catastrophic. Crops fail. People starve. Monks, who depend on donations, start dying. Then war. Internal conflicts. Invasions from South India. Monasteries get destroyed. The surviving monks look around and realize something terrifying. They're losing the teachings, not because people stopped believing, because the monks who had memorized entire sections of the Tipiṭaka were dying. Younger monks, weakened by famine, couldn't maintain the same level of memorization. Whole sections of the Abhidhamma held by maybe 10 monks. If those 10 die, it's gone. Imagine one elder monk, maybe 60 years old, who's carried the Pathana in his memory for 40 years. He's teaching a young student, but he's getting weaker. The student is learning, but not fast enough. And the teacher knows if he dies before the transmission is complete, a piece of the Buddha dies with him. The monks have an emergency council. Someone suggests something that had never been done before in the entire history of Buddhism. We need to write it down. This is massive. This is revolutionary. For over 400 years, since the Buddha's death, the Dhamma had been preserved through oral tradition, through memorization, through the minds of trained monks. Writing was for administrative records, for trade, for government documents, sacred teachings. Those lived in human memory. But the monks recognized the reality. The old way is failing. If they want to preserve what the Buddha actually taught, if they want future generations to have access to his exact words, they have to do something unprecedented. They gather at Aluvihara, a cave monastery in central Sri Lanka. The caves are massive, natural formations in the rock, cool and dry, perfect for preservation. And they start writing. They use talapat palm leaves, each leaf about 2 feet long, 6 inches wide. The surface has to be prepared carefully, boiled, dried, pressed, smoothed. The stylus is made from iron, sharp enough to carve, gentle enough not to tear. Each letter carved, then soot mixed with oil rubbed into the grooves to make them visible. One leaf holds maybe 8 to 10 lines of text. The entire Tipiṭaka, tens of thousands of leaves. The monks create bundles, wrapping groups of leaves between wooden covers, tying them with cord. Palm leaves last maybe a few centuries before they decay, which means every generation would need to copy them again. The work never ends. How long did this take? The chronicles don't say exactly, but scholars estimate the first writing took years, maybe decades, multiple generations of monks contributing. Some monks recite from memory, others carve, others check for accuracy, and when they're done, when the last word is carved. The Theravada tradition has the world's first complete written record of the Buddha's teachings. Theravada means teaching of the elders, the senior monks, the ones who claimed direct lineage back to the Buddha's original disciples. Remember we talked about the 3 major schools of Buddhism? Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana. Each developed different approaches. This is where Theravada becomes distinct. Their whole identity was built on preservation, on keeping the teachings exactly as the Buddha gave them. In Pali, the ancient language of these teachings, preserved word for word, on not adding, not changing, not innovating. And now they had proof. The Pali Canon, the Tipiṭaka written in the Pali language, written down, fixed, permanent. The Vinaya Pitaka, every rule for monastic conduct. The Sutta Piṭaka, every discourse the Buddha gave. The Abhidhamma Pitaka, the systematic philosophy. All of it, preserved in writing. At that moment, those monks probably thought they were protecting Buddhism in Sri Lanka. They had no idea they were protecting Buddhism everywhere, because what happened next in India, nobody saw coming. Buddhism in India, the birthplace of the Dhamma, was about to face centuries of gradual decline. We covered this in detail in another video, the complex reasons why Buddhism eventually disappeared from most of India. If you want the full story, check that out. But here's what matters for understanding Sri Lanka's role. After Aśoka dies in 232 BCE, royal support fragments. Over the next several centuries, Buddhism in India slowly weakens. Hindu philosophy absorbs Buddhist ideas. The Buddha himself gets incorporated into Hindu cosmology. Regional kingdoms shift patronage. By the 7th century CE, Buddhism is declining, concentrating in specific centers like Nalanda University. Then, starting around 1000 CE, invasions from Central Asia. Muslim rulers target the Buddhist monasteries. In 1193 CE, Nalanda burns. The greatest Buddhist university in the world, gone. By the 13th century, Buddhism had essentially disappeared from most of India. The center was gone, monks scattered to Nepal, Tibet, Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, on an island to the south, Sri Lanka kept practicing, kept teaching, kept copying those palm leaf manuscripts. The oral tradition that started with the Buddha's disciples, the written record preserved in Pali, continuous, alive. And that's when the world realized, for Theravada Buddhism specifically, Sri Lanka had become irreplaceable. By the 13th century, Sri Lanka realizes something remarkable. They're not just one branch of Theravada anymore. They're the root. Now, Buddhism survived in many places. Mahayana Buddhism was thriving in China, Korea, Japan. Vajrayana Buddhism was strong in Tibet. Different branches, different lineages, different texts. But for Theravada specifically, for the tradition that claimed to preserve the Buddha's original words in Pali, for the oldest written Buddhist canon, Sri Lanka was the anchor point. Think about what that means. Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, all practicing Theravada Buddhism. All of them trace their ordination lineages back to Sri Lanka. That's the Theravada sphere across Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, Mahayana Buddhism in China and Japan developed independently from different sources. But for Theravada specifically, the island that Mahinda sailed to, hoping Buddhism might take root there, it became the tree. This is why Sri Lankan Theravada has such authority within the Theravada tradition. They maintained continuity while the Indian source dried up. The texts written on palm leaves, the ordination lineages that kept restarting when they had to, the sacred Bodhi tree, a sapling from the original tree the Buddha sat under, brought from India 2,300 years ago, still growing in Anuradhapura today. Even the Buddha's tooth relic, protected through wars, invasions, colonialism, preserved in the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy. Sri Lanka didn't just preserve Buddhism's ideas, they preserved everything they could. 23 centuries, continuous study of the Pali Canon, wars, colonialism, famines, invasions, the tradition held. And then something beautiful happens. The 19th century arrives. British colonialism spreads across Asia. Western scholars start studying Buddhism. They're fascinated. But Buddhism in India, almost gone. So where do scholars go to study Buddhism? Sri Lanka. Where do Indians interested in reviving Buddhism in their homeland go? Sri Lanka. The Mahabodhi Society, founded by Anagarika Dharmapala in 1891, begins work to restore Buddhist sites in India. They bring teachers from Sri Lanka. They translate Pali texts. They establish new monasteries. Buddhism returns to India, not from some external source, from the place that preserved it. The land that first spread the Dhamma, receiving it back from the island that saved it. Today, tens of millions of people across Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and far beyond practice Theravada Buddhism. And most of them will never realize their path runs back through Sri Lanka to a group of monks carving lines into palm leaves during a famine 2,000 years ago. So here's the question nobody asks. Did Sri Lanka save Theravada Buddhism, or did Theravada Buddhism save Sri Lanka? Because Sri Lanka faced everything India faced. Invasions from South India, colonial occupation by the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British. Internal wars, dynastic conflicts, economic collapse. Multiple times the island could have lost its identity, could have been absorbed, could have become something else entirely. But through everything, Buddhism remained. The monasteries, the ordination lineages, the Pali Canon, the meditation practices. They gave Sri Lanka continuity, an identity that survived when kingdoms fell, a center that held when everything else was chaos. The teachings survived because the people protected them, and the people survived, culturally, spiritually, because the teachings guided them. When you trace Theravada's journey, you see how many times it could have ended. Born in Lumbini, in what's now Nepal. The Buddha achieved enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, spent 45 years teaching across northern India. We covered his life in another video. Those teachings spread across Asia. Different cultures adapted them. But for those teachings to reach us 2,500 years later, they had to survive wars, political collapse, religious persecution, cultural change, natural disasters. At multiple points, the entire tradition could have disappeared, but it didn't, because people made choices. Ananda memorized every discourse. The first council verified everything. Mahinda sailed to an unknown island. Sri Lankan monks chose to write it down. Generation after generation kept copying, kept teaching, kept practicing. Think about what gets lost in your own life. Family stories nobody wrote down. Wisdom from grandparents nobody recorded. Skills that died with the last person who knew them. That's what almost happened to Buddhism. Sometimes preserving something means more than keeping it alive. It means giving it a home, a place where it belongs, where it can grow, where it can weather storms, where future generations, people who haven't even been born yet, will find it waiting for them. Sri Lanka didn't save Buddhism by doing something dramatic once. They saved it by showing up every day for 23 centuries, by being the place where the teachings could live. Not just survive, not just exist. Live, breathe, grow. That's the difference between preserving something and killing it by keeping it too safe. Sri Lanka didn't lock Buddhism in a museum. They practiced it, questioned it, studied it, debated it, lived by it. And because they did that for 23 centuries, it's still alive. So that's Theravada Buddhism, the teaching of the elders, the tradition that says our job isn't to add, our job is to preserve. And because Sri Lankan monks took that seriously, Buddhism's oldest teachings still exist. Let me know in the comments. Which Buddhist school resonates with you? Theravada's focus on preservation, Mahayana's bodhisattva path, Vajrayana's tantric practices, or maybe you're still figuring it out. If you want to understand more about how these schools differ, check out our video on the 3 schools of Buddhism. It breaks down exactly where they diverged and why. And if this story of preservation and survival interests you, next time we might explore the Pali Canon itself. What's actually in these texts? Subscribe so you don't miss it. Share this with someone interested in Buddhism. And I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.